I want to be honest with you about something from the very beginning, because this story does not make me look entirely sympathetic, and I think you deserve to know that going in. What I did was deliberate. It was calculated. It was sustained over 5 years, with a level of consistency that required genuine effort and occasional outright deception. I am not going to stand here and tell you it was obviously the right thing to do, because I am not sure it was. What I am going to tell you is why I did it, what I found, and what it cost me, including the parts that cost me things I did not expect to lose. Make of it what you will. I am 44 years old. I come from a large family, 4 siblings, an extended network of aunts and uncles and cousins that functions, as many large families do, as its own small ecosystem with its own politics and hierarchies and unspoken rules. My parents are both still alive, in their early 70s, retired, living in the house where I grew up. I should tell you about the money, because the money is the context without which nothing else makes sense. I work in technology. I will not be more specific than that, because specificity would identify me in ways I am not comfortable with. What I will tell you is that I have been in my field for 18 years, and that I have been, for the last 12 of those years, successful by any reasonable measure of that word. Not famous founder successful, not private jet successful, but quietly, substantially, life-changingly successful, in the way that a combination of skill and timing and some good decisions can produce if you work in the right industry during the right decade. I own my home outright. I have investments that are doing well. I have a financial cushion that would allow me to stop working today and live comfortably, not extravagantly, for the rest of my life if I were careful. I am comfortable. I am secure. I am, by the standards of most of the world, wealthy, and by the standards of my family of origin, extraordinarily so. My family does not come from money. My parents worked hard their entire lives and provided well for 5 children, and retired with enough to be comfortable, but not with anything extra. My siblings are all in reasonable, but not exceptional financial positions. There is nothing wrong with any of this. These are just facts. The problem, or the beginning of the problem, started about 9 years ago, when my financial situation became known within the family. I had been careful about it for years. Not secretive exactly, but private. I did not discuss my salary. I did not discuss my investments. I drove a reasonable car. I dressed without ostentation. I had always believed that money talked about openly became money that other people felt entitled to have opinions about, and I had no interest in that. But families are porous things. Information moves through them whether you direct it or not. My mother mentioned my job to an aunt, who mentioned it to a cousin who mentioned it at a family gathering. And suddenly the general shape of my financial situation was common knowledge, not the specifics, but enough. Enough for people to know that I was doing well, enough for the dynamic to shift. The shift was not dramatic. It was gradual and subtle, and felt at first like something I was probably imagining. The phone calls that started to include mentions of financial difficulty. The gatherings where someone would say something about how lucky I was, or how nice it must be to not have to worry. The requests, which began small and occasional and became over 2 or 3 years, regular and sometimes large. My brother Kevin asked me to lend him $12,000 for a business idea that he was certain would succeed. I lent it. The business did not succeed. He has not repaid it, and we have not discussed it since. That was 7 years ago. My sister Donna asked me to cover the cost of a family vacation, a 60th birthday celebration for our mother, because she wanted to do something special and didn't have the budget for what she had in mind. I covered it. The vacation happened. Nobody thanked me specifically, because my contribution had been quietly absorbed into the event as if it had simply materialized, and Donna received credit for organizing a wonderful trip. My cousin Richie called 3 times in 1 year with financial emergencies, each one urgent, each one with a story attached that I could not verify and that I now believe were at least partially constructed. I helped twice. The 3rd time I said I was stretched, which was not true, and he has been noticeably cooler toward me since. There were more. I am giving you the examples that stand out, not the complete inventory, which is longer and more dispiriting than these highlights suggest. What I noticed over time was a pattern that I found genuinely difficult to sit with. The people in my family who called most frequently were calling about money. The people who expressed interest in my life, my work, my well-being, were increasingly doing so as a preamble to a request. There were family members I had not spoken to in months who would call with a warmth and attentiveness that I had learned to recognize as the particular warmth of someone who needs something and is doing the work of re-establishing connection before making the ask. I also noticed, and this is the part that bothered me most, who did not call. Which family members were quietly, consistently present without ever arriving at a request. Who reached out on birthdays, not because a birthday was a good occasion to re-establish contact before asking for something, but because they actually wanted to say happy birthday. Who called just to talk, just to check in, just to tell me something funny that had happened, or ask my opinion on something that had nothing to do with money. The list of those people was shorter than I wanted it to be. I began to wonder, in the honest way that you wonder about things in the middle of the night when you cannot avoid your own thoughts, what my family actually was without the money. Whether the warmth I received at gatherings was warmth for me or warmth for what I represented. Whether the phone calls were about connection or about access. Whether the love, and I do believe most of it is love, was love for me specifically or love for the version of me that had resources they might need. I did not want to believe the worst version of this. I am not a cynical person by nature. But I had enough data points by then that I could not fully dismiss the question either. The experiment began not as a formal decision, but as a test I ran almost by accident. I was talking to my sister Donna on the phone, about 8 years ago now, and she was in the middle of a financial situation that she was describing in detail and that she was clearly building toward asking me to help with. And I said, on an impulse that surprised even me, as I heard the words come out, that I was actually in a difficult stretch myself. I said that I had some investments that hadn't performed the way I expected, and that I was being careful with money at the moment. It was not true. Everything was fine. But I said it. And then I listened. The warmth in Donna's voice changed. Subtly, not cruelly, but perceptibly. The conversation moved faster toward its conclusion. She said she was sorry to hear that, and hoped things improved, and she would figure out her situation on her own, and she needed to get going. We were off the phone within 3 minutes. I sat with that for a while. 3 days later, she called again. Warmer this time, back to the attentive Donna I was familiar with. She asked how I was doing and how my situation was looking. I said still uncertain. She expressed sympathy. The call was brief and friendly, and entirely without the particular quality that I had learned to recognize in calls that were building towards something. She called again 2 weeks later. Same warmth, same attentiveness. No ask. I thought about what I was observing. Then I thought about it more carefully, and I made a decision that I want to describe honestly. I decided to extend the experiment, not indefinitely, but meaningfully. Long enough to get real information rather than a data point from a single conversation. I decided to maintain the fiction of financial difficulty across my family, broadly and consistently, for long enough to see what happened to the relationships. I want to acknowledge something here. What I was doing was deception. There is no framing that changes that. I was lying to people I loved about something material. I was doing it deliberately, and I was doing it with an analytical purpose, which makes it more calculated rather than less dishonest. I am not presenting this as admirable. I am presenting it as what I actually did and why. I also want to acknowledge that I stopped helping financially during this period. This is the part that I find hardest to sit with in retrospect. There were people in my family who had real financial difficulties during those 5 years, genuine ones, not manufactured stories, and I did not help them because I was maintaining a fiction. I told myself I would make it right afterward. I did, largely. But the help arrived later than it could have, and I think about that. The preparation required some structure. I told the same story consistently, with enough specificity to be credible and enough vagueness to be impossible to verify. I had made some investments in my telling that had not performed. I had taken on some financial obligations that were straining my budget. I was fine, but I was careful. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would generate serious concern, just enough to explain why the resource that people had come to associate with me was no longer reliably available. I was careful to maintain the story consistently across different conversations, because large families are remarkably good at cross-referencing information without realizing they are doing it. I noted what I had said to whom. I was consistent. I did not oversell the difficulty or make it a dramatic narrative. I just let it sit there as a quiet context, a background condition, and I observed. What I observed in the first year was a sorting. Some people drifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, just gradually. The calls becoming less frequent, the interest becoming less specific. Richie essentially disappeared, which I had predicted, and which confirmed something I had already suspected. A cousin named Barbara, who had called me reliably every few months, always warmly, always eventually getting around to mentioning something she was dealing with financially, called twice in the first year, and not at all in the second. I tracked this. Not obsessively, but carefully. I noted who maintained contact, and who drifted, and what the quality of the maintained contact looked like. Was it genuine interest, or was it periodic check-ins to see if my situation had improved? There were people who surprised me in both directions. My brother Kevin, who had borrowed $12,000 and never repaid it, who I had honestly begun to write off as someone whose relationship with me was primarily transactional, called in the third month of the experiment just to talk. He had heard, through the family network, that I was going through a difficult stretch. He called not to offer help. I don't think he was in a position to offer meaningful help, but to tell me he was thinking about me. We talked for an hour about things that had nothing to do with money. He told me about his kids. He asked about my life. He was warm in a way that was unrelated to anything he could get from me in this period. I was not expecting that from Kevin. My Aunt Patricia, my mother's sister, who I had always found warm, but with whom I had never been particularly close, called twice in the first year to check on me. The second time she mentioned, very quietly, that if I ever needed anything, she had some savings, and she meant it, and I shouldn't be embarrassed. She said it in the way my grandmother used to offer things, plainly and without the expectation of being taken up on it, just wanting me to know it was there. I nearly ended the experiment right then. I did not. I thanked her and said I was managing and changed the subject. But I held that phone call carefully for a long time. My sister Renee, who is 2 years younger than me, and who I had always been close to, but who I had sometimes wondered about during the years of requests and financial proximity, was one of the clearest revelations of the entire 5 years. Renee called more during the experiment than she had called before it. Not to ask, not to check if my situation had improved, just to talk. She started a habit of calling on Sunday evenings, just to check in, and those calls became something I genuinely looked forward to, in a way that made me feel something complicated about the experiment I was running. Because what I was discovering was that Renee was exactly what I had hoped she was. That her love for me was not contingent. That she was interested in me as a person, and not as a resource. That the warmth I had always felt from her was real in the way that things are real when they do not change based on what you can offer. She does not know I was testing anyone. I want to be clear about that. She was just being herself, which is the whole point. Year 2 brought further clarification. The people who had drifted were mostly gone now, their absence having settled into a steady state rather than a trend. The people who had stayed were calling in patterns that were becoming legible. Some were staying connected out of genuine affection. Some were staying connected in a lower-key way, I think, because they had not entirely given up on the situation resolving, and were maintaining the relationship as a kind of investment. The difference between these two groups was discernible if you paid attention. The way I came to distinguish them was this. The genuine ones talked about themselves too, not in the self-absorbed way of someone who isn't listening, but in the reciprocal way of someone who understands that a relationship is a two-way transmission. They told me things. They shared things about their own lives without calculating whether sharing was useful. They called when they had good news, and not only when they needed something. They remembered things I had told them previously and asked follow-up questions, which is the simplest and most reliable indicator I know of genuine interest in another person. The maintenance callers, the ones whose presence I suspected was partly strategic, tended to ask about my situation more often than about my life. There is a difference between those two things that is subtle but real. Asking about my situation meant asking about the finances, framed considerately but pointed in that direction. Asking about my life meant asking about what I was reading, or thinking about, or struggling with, or looking forward to. The texture of being a person, rather than the status of a resource. By year 3, I had a fairly clear picture. I will not give you a precise accounting. Not because I don't have one, but because naming specific family members in specific categories feels like something that could do harm I am not trying to do. What I will tell you is that the picture was not what I had feared, and not entirely what I had hoped. The feared version was that most of my family's warmth toward me was conditional and financial. That was not what I found. The majority of the close relationships I had going into the experiment maintained themselves through the experiment in ways that gave me confidence in them. The warmth from my parents did not change at all. My father called on the same schedule, with the same content, the same mix of sports commentary, and gentle parental checking in that had characterized his calls my entire adult life. My mother called more than before, actually, out of what I understood to be concern, and her concern was real and wholly unrelated to my financial status, and was the kind of concern that made me feel, not for the first time, that I had been very lucky in the parents I had been given. The finding was more surgical than that. It was not that most of my family didn't love me. It was that a specific subset, maybe a quarter of the relationships I had been investing in, relationships I had prioritized and shown up for and helped financially and thought of as important, those relationships thinned dramatically in the absence of access. And within that subset, several had been, I now believed, primarily maintained by the financial proximity. They had not been relationships so much as arrangements, comfortable and warm-surfaced arrangements, but arrangements nonetheless. That sounds simple when I say it plainly. It was not simple to live inside. Because the people whose relationships thinned were not villains. They were family members with their own pressures and histories and needs. They had not calculated their love for me in a spreadsheet and decided it was contingent. They had just, over time, and without fully examining it, oriented themselves toward me in a way that was shaped by what I could provide. And when that was no longer available, the orientation changed, because orientation tends to follow availability. I do not think most of them knew they were doing it. That is somehow harder to hold than if they had been cynical about it. Year 4. I came close to ending the experiment twice. The first time was when my cousin Barbara called, out of the blue, after nearly 2 years of absence. She called not about money, but because she had heard something about my health, a minor thing that had gotten exaggerated through the family network, and she was worried. She was warm and specific and present in a way that surprised me. We talked for 40 minutes. I thought about what her call meant, whether it represented a genuine rediscovery of connection, or a recalibration based on new information, and I decided I did not have enough data yet, and I stayed in the experiment. The second time I came close to ending it was a conversation with my mother. She said something quietly, at the end of a call, that has stayed with me. She said she hoped I knew that she and my father would be there for me no matter what happened with money or work or anything else. She said it simply, as a statement of fact rather than a reassurance, as if she were confirming something obvious. She said, "We've always been proud of you for who you are, not for what you've done." I think she meant it as comfort. I sat with it as something more complicated than comfort, because I was in the middle of an experiment designed to answer a question she had just answered without knowing she was being asked. I ended the experiment at the 5-year mark. Not dramatically. I did not announce it. I did not reveal to most people what I had been doing. What I did was begin, gradually, to let the financial fiction dissolve. I mentioned that things had stabilized. I mentioned that some earlier concerns had resolved. I let the context quietly normalize over several months without making it a moment. I observed who noticed. I observed who called more frequently as the story changed. I observed whether the patterns that had established themselves over 5 years held, or whether they recalibrated toward the old dynamic as the old context returned. Some did. The maintenance callers, the ones I had identified, did warm up again as the situation appeared to resolve. Their attentiveness increased in a way that was meaningful if you were tracking it, which I was. This confirmed what I had suspected about the quality of those relationships. The genuine ones, the Renees and the Kevins in his more honest moments, and the Aunt Patricias, they did not change. Because they had not changed during the 5 years either. Their pattern had been their pattern throughout, and its continuation was simply its continuation. I told 3 people what I had done. Daniel is my closest friend, not a family member, and telling him was necessary, because he had known the full picture throughout, and had been, honestly, uncomfortable with aspects of what I was doing, and had said so on more than one occasion. He is a more straightforwardly ethical person than I am in some respects, and his discomfort with the experiment was a data point I took seriously, even when I chose not to act on it. I told Renee. I told her 2 years after the experiment ended. I told her because I felt she deserved to know, and because telling her was a form of respect for what I had found out about her. She was quiet for a long time on the phone. Then she said she wasn't sure whether to be touched or unsettled. I told her I understood both responses. She said she wished I had just asked her directly whether she loved me for me, and I told her that asking directly would have produced a direct answer and that I had needed something different. She said she supposed she understood that. She forgave me, I think. We talk on Sunday evening still. The third person I told was my mother. I told her last year. She took it more seriously than I expected, which is to say she did not brush it off or laugh or immediately reassure me. She sat with it. She said she thought she understood why I had done it. She said she was sad that I had felt I needed to. She asked me what I had found. I told her, in general terms, without specifics. She nodded slowly and said she hoped I knew how to tell the difference between people who loved me imperfectly and people who didn't really love me at all, because she thought those were different things, and both deserved different responses. That is the most useful thing anyone has said to me about any of this. People who love you imperfectly, people who don't really love you at all. Both real categories, neither requiring the same response. What I know now that I did not know with the same clarity before is this. Some of my family loved me for me, and some of them loved me for the access I represented, and some of them loved me in both ways simultaneously, imperfectly, and genuinely at once, human and complicated, and not fully reducible to either category. The experiment did not produce clean findings because people are not clean. They are interested in what you can offer, and also genuinely attached to you. They love you, and they also need things. These are not mutually exclusive states. What the experiment gave me was not a list of good family members and bad ones. What it gave me was a clearer sense of where to put my energy. Which relationships were worth investing in because they were real in the full sense. Which relationships were worth maintaining at a reduced level because the warmth in them was real even if it was also conditional. Which relationships were worth letting go of, not in anger, but in clarity. With the understanding that some connections are primarily transactional, and that there is no amount of effort or investment that changes that fundamental nature. I still help family members financially. I have since the experiment ended. I helped Kevin with a genuine emergency last year, and I did not keep track of it against the 12,000, and I do not intend to. I helped Donna with something real and meaningful, and I did it because I wanted to. Not because I felt obligated, and not because I was performing generosity. The helping feels different now. It comes from a clearer place, a place that knows what it is giving, and to whom and why, rather than a place of anxiety about what withholding would mean for relationships I was not sure were real. That clarity was worth something. I am still deciding whether it was worth the 5 years it took to get it, and whether there was a less costly way to arrive at the same place. I suspect there might have been. I suspect that the conversations I could have had, directly, honestly, about what I needed from the people I loved, might have produced similar information with less collateral damage. But I am not sure I was capable of those conversations at the time. I am not sure I trusted the answers enough to build on them. I needed to see behavior rather than hear declarations, and the experiment gave me behavior. Here is what I found, distilled to its plainest form. Most of my family loves me. Not all of them love me in ways that are primarily about me, rather than about what I represent. The ones who do love me that way are the most valuable people in my life, and they are worth everything I have, and I will not take them for granted again. The rest I hold differently now. Not coldly. Not with resentment. Just honestly. With clear eyes and appropriate distance, the way you hold things that are real, but limited. My Sunday evenings belong to Renee. My parents get the most consistent version of my presents that I know how to give. My Aunt Patricia got a birthday call last month and was so surprised and pleased that I made a note to call her more often. Kevin still owes me $12,000. I have decided I don't need it back. What I got in its place, the hour-long call in the third month of the experiment from a man I had partially written off, was worth more than $12,000 to me. I am not sure he knows that. I do not intend to tell him. Some things are mine to keep quietly. My name is mine. My money is mine. My family is mine. The ones who showed up. The ones who drifted. The ones I understand now with a clarity I did not have before. 5 years is a long time to run an experiment on the people you love. I know that. I sit with that. But the data was real, and some truths you cannot arrive at any other way. Thank you for watching. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. Know who your people are. Call them on Sundays. Tell them things that have nothing to do with money. More stories are coming. I will see you in the next one.